Okay. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Georgia's Weather, a Year in Review and What to Expect this Hurricane Season, which is brought to you by Georgia Homeplace, which is a project of the Georgia Public Library Service, and the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance of Atlanta. Slides and documents from today's event can be found at bit.ly/Georgia's Weather, and I've also included that link in the chat box. My name is Angela Stanley, and I'm Director of Georgia Homeplace for GPLS. We are so pleased to help bring you this webinar today. If you have a question or would like to provide feedback about the series, please complete the survey that you'll be directed to following the webinar's conclusion. If you're unfamiliar with the Georgia Public Library Service, we're Georgia's state library and part of the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia. We provide services and resources to Georgia's 62 public library systems, and we partner with leading institutions like the Digital Library of Georgia to democratize access to digitization technologies and cultural heritage content. I encourage you to check out our websites and explore some of the many resources available to you. The Heritage Emergency Response Alliance was founded in 2007 as part of the National Alliance for Response Initiative. It is a nonprofit network of institutions and individuals interested in preserving and protecting cultural heritage in Metro Atlanta and serving as a resource to institutions across Georgia. Their primary goal is to mitigate loss of collections in the event of a disaster. They provide resources, support, and training to aid cultural institutions in preparing for and recovering from emergencies and disasters of all types. Currently, HERA has about 100 members on their listserv. Please join HERA and follow them on social media. There is a fillable membership form on the website, and no prior experience in disaster planning is necessary. They try to have at least one educational program per year, and they are thrilled to partner with allied institutions such as GPLS. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be made available in multiple places. You can check out any of the links on your screen, and these links will be emailed to participants once the recording becomes available. Additionally, continuing education credit is available for those participants that require it. You can contact Dorcas Davis at ddavis@georgialibraries.org to request a certificate. Lastly, we ask you to please save the date for the next webinar in Homeplace's collaborative series with the Digital Library of Georgia, a town hall meeting with updates on DLG progress towards its goals, scheduled for July 18th at 2 p.m. Registration is available at the link on your screen and will also be copied into the chat box shortly. All right, now on to today's agenda. I am pleased to welcome today's presenter, Will Langston. Will has served as a meteorologist, hurricane planner, and hurricane program manager for the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency since May 2014. He previously worked for WSB-TV and interned at the National Weather Service. Will is an Atlanta native and graduated from Georgia Tech in 2013 with a degree in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Will is happy to take questions throughout the presentation. Simply type them into the chat box as they arise, and we'll be sure to address them as time allows. And now I'm going to hand it over to Will for his presentation.
All right. All right, so can you see my slides?
Hey, Will, yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, so like Angela said, I'm Will Langston. I have been the state meteorologist for Georgia for a little over 5 years, and my main responsibility with Georgia is really going to be a lot of what we talk about today is just forecasting and making sure that our leadership at the state level is updated with the most up-to-date information and forecast data for any hazardous weather events in the state. And the 4 main types of weather that we get in Georgia that cause impacts generally or a hazard to life and property is tropical storms and hurricanes. We get severe weather, we get winter weather, and we also get flooding, whether it's river flooding or flash flooding, urban flooding, those type of things. So that's basically what I'm going to cover today, is just a few examples of those types of hazardous weather that we've been through over the last year or so. And we're going to talk about how well those events were forecast. We're going to talk about what we can do to prepare for when those occur again. We're going to talk about the historical significance of these events. How rare are they? When can we expect something like that again statistically? And finally, a little tease, what can we expect this hurricane season? As you know, hurricane season started at the beginning of June, but really about 93% of all tropical activity occurs from August 1st through the end of November. So we really haven't hit the start of hurricane season statistically yet, even though we're in the month of June. So again, over the past 12 months or so, Georgia has experienced one of the worst hurricanes to ever impact the United States. That's Hurricane Michael. We've had multiple months of flooding rainfall. We had a week or two in December where we got pretty close to seeing some major flooding in various parts of the state. And then again in February, we had just seemed like it was never going to stop raining. We had our lone snow scare of the winter was just so happened to be the week of the Super Bowl in Atlanta. And then we also had a major tornado outbreak the first week of March. So I'm going to cover all of those in this presentation. And again, I'm looking at how well these events were forecast, what the historical significance of them are, what we can expect going into the late summer, early fall as far as hurricanes go, and then most importantly, what can we do to prepare for when, not if, but when these significant hazardous weather events occur again in Georgia. So the specific events I'm going to talk about are Hurricane Florence. Even though Hurricane Florence didn't impact Georgia, I'll get to that. Hurricane Michael, December 2018 flooding, January 2019 winter weather, flooding again in February, March 3rd tornado outbreak, and then we had a couple of severe weather events on April 14th and April 19th. So let me start with Hurricane Florence, and we'll take these in chronological order. And again, if you have any questions that come up during the presentation, I think because we'll be jumping from event to event, if you want to type them in the chat box and we can answer them kind of while I'm talking about them, that might be the most helpful. Hurricane Florence was very well forecast. This is the left-hand picture is the forecast from 5 days out, and then the image on the right is at landfall. And so you can see 5 days out that the official National Hurricane Center forecast for Hurricane Florence last year in September was pretty much headed straight towards the North Carolina-South Carolina border. And that didn't really deviate over the next 5 days. What made landfall right around the border of North Carolina and South Carolina along the coast. The intensity forecast was really difficult. They were calling for a major hurricane to make landfall. It looked like that was going to happen up until about 12 to 24 hours before it made landfall. the storm really put the brakes on, slowed down significantly, and just before it made landfall, the maximum winds actually dropped to Category 2 status. So it was being forecast as a Category 4 hurricane all week. The Weather Channel had a headline that was calling Florence the storm of a lifetime, and it certainly looked like that was going to be the case. And then what we saw happen was, once it dropped from a major hurricane, Category 4, down to a Category 2, unfortunately, the messaging that the public seemed to get from that was that the hurricane as a whole had weakened by 2 categories. And so even though a lot of people evacuated, the general public viewpoint was that the storm was no longer a major hurricane, it was only a Category 2, even though the only thing that had really changed was the maximum winds in the middle of the storm. Everything else about the hurricane was basically unchanged. It was a large hurricane that was going to cause some devastating storm surge along the coast of North Carolina and parts of South Carolina. It was going to bring a ton of rainfall, and those things didn't change, even though the category of the storm was downgraded from a 4 to a 2. And so, unfortunately, that made the public feel like it might have been a busted forecast. We had been calling for a Category 4 hurricane all week, and it was only a Category 2. But in fact, the impacts remained pretty unchanged. So the lesson here from Hurricane Florence is that you don't want to get too wrapped up in what specific category it is or what the specific maximum winds are, because that only impacts about 15 or 20 miles along the coast where the actual center of the hurricane hits. So instead of getting 140 mile per hour winds, those areas only got 110 mile per hour winds. That doesn't make a huge difference, and everything else about the storm was pretty much the same. So don't get caught up in the category of the storm necessarily or the maximum winds. You really want to focus on what the impacts are, because those things don't change very quickly. You can see rapid category changes either upward or downward, and the impacts remain the same. This area along the North Carolina coast still got huge amounts of storm surge, 12 to 15 feet of storm surge in parts. They got, some spots saw 20 to 30 inches of rainfall, and it was very reminiscent of Hurricane Harvey from the previous year, in that there was a lot of storm surge and that the rainfall was really the biggest threat from this storm because it was moving so slowly. Florence was also really an unprecedented hurricane because of the specific track that it took. So on my screen, if you look on the left-hand side, this is when the hurricane was about in this area right here. And what the people who made this map wanted to know is, of all the hurricanes that have ever been at this specific location where Florence was, any hurricane or tropical system ever here, where did it end up tracking? And not a single one of those hurricanes that was in this specific location ever came close to the United States coast. So when Florence was making a track to here, we were pretty confident that it wasn't going to impact the United States, because no hurricane had ever impacted the United States from this point. And again, on the right-hand graphic, no other hurricane in history had ever taken this track right here, then take a left turn, come towards the coast, and then right when it was about to hit the coast, it slowed way down and actually took another left-hand turn and went southward. And no landfalling hurricane had ever done that as well. So Florence was unprecedented in its track. It should have probably been a major hurricane, but just took a little bit of change at the last second for it to be downgraded to a Category 2. So the reason I'm talking about this, even though it didn't apply to Georgia, is because somehow Georgia actually got put under a 159 county-wide state of emergency for a hurricane that brought us nothing but some high clouds and really good weather. So about 2 days before the hurricane made landfall, the president tweeted that the storm looked like it was making a turn towards Georgia. Now, at the State Operations Center at GEMA, we were already in the State Operations Center. We were activated on the very off chance that something like this were to happen. Since we had seen this hurricane had already taken unprecedented turns twice already, we certainly were not discounting the fact that it could happen again. Some models were actually showing it move all the way down the South Carolina coast and make landfall in Savannah. So just in case something like that happened, we were in the State Operations Center ready to ramp things up if it needed to be. And then this tweet got sent out about 8 or 8:30 in the morning, and to everyone's surprise, it was apparently turning towards Georgia, according to the president. That was to the surprise of all of the forecasters. Nobody was talking about it on TV, but it put us in an awkward position of having to make a decision on what we should do with that information being put out there. So out of an abundance of caution, the governor of Georgia placed all 159 counties under a state of emergency, just in case, and really just because the president had tweeted that. Long story short, we get not a drop of rain from this hurricane in Georgia. However, the chance was there, and it was pretty devastating for parts of coastal South and North Carolina. The good thing for GEMA from Florence was that we had just gotten our new SOC set up. We had been working on upgrading our State Operations Center, our facility that we operate out of during emergencies and during activations. And so we had just moved into the State Operations Center a few weeks before Florence. So even though we didn't really have a whole lot to do for this storm, it gave us a good opportunity to run a test run through the facility. And it was good that we did so because we found a lot of bugs in the facility, audio, visual connections and whatnot that we really needed to figure out, because just a few weeks after Hurricane Florence was Hurricane Michael, which formed in the Bay of Campeche, and it formed and intensified extremely quickly. So the image on the left is the very first National Hurricane Center advisory that was sent out on Saturday, October the 6th, calling for a landfall of a tropical storm the following Wednesday. So that's 5 days out, 4 days out, calling for a landfall from the very first advisory. 2 days later, it was a hurricane, and this is the image on the right. It was a hurricane with 80-mile-per-hour winds, and it was forecast to now make landfall in the panhandle of Florida as a major hurricane in less than 2 days. So in 2 days, it went from a 30-mile-per-hour storm to an 80-mile-per-hour storm, and then less than 2 days after that, from an 80-mile-per-hour storm to making landfall as a 155-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane in the panhandle of Florida. Recently, the Hurricane Center has done their research and perspective. They look back at Hurricane Michael using a lot of data that they may not have had at the time they made the forecast as it was making landfall. they determined that Hurricane Michael was actually a Category 5 at landfall. So this was the first Category 5 landfalling hurricane in the United States since Hurricane Andrew in 1992. And again, from the storm's conception to its landfall as a Category 5 hurricane, there were only 4 days between that. So it went from nothing to Cat 5, making landfall in 4 days. That's extremely uncommon. It's not surprising that it happened in the Gulf of Mexico because the Gulf of Mexico was extremely warm. There was no wind shear, so the variables were favorable for it to rapidly intensify, and it did. And the other thing is, just like Florence, the track forecast for Hurricane Michael was also extremely well forecast. You can see on the left there, 5 days out, 4 days out, it's calling for a landfall in the panhandle of Florida, and that's exactly where it made landfall. I want to say that when I looked at it at the time, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Michael, I think they made landfall about less than 20 miles away from where the forecast said they would make landfall 5 days out. The average error for those type of forecasts is about 140 miles 5 days out. So to get the forecast right within about 20 miles or so was extraordinary, and that was by the National Hurricane Center. It moved through the panhandle of Florida, and I'll show you some radar satellite images in a second, but really kept its structure very well as it moved over land. You usually see these tropical storms, the center of the storm or the eye of the hurricane as it moves over land really starts to weaken, the eye kind of fills in, and you start to see the storm kind of shred itself apart. That really didn't happen until after the hurricane had moved into southwest Georgia. There was still a pretty clearly defined eye, even as the storm moved into southwest Georgia. And you can see these are the estimated wind gusts from Hurricane Michael as it moved through Georgia. Obviously, the number that sticks out is that 115 mile per hour wind gust in the far southwest part of the state in Seminole County. That was in Bainbridge. And a lot of this data we were very lucky to get because a lot of the instruments that were being used to measure the wind speeds were destroyed by the hurricane. So for most of these readings in southwest Georgia, this was probably the last reading that was picked up on before the instrument was damaged or destroyed or at least stopped communicating. But to get hurricane force wind gusts in southwest Georgia is very uncommon. In fact, this was unprecedented for the region of Georgia that it hit in southwest Georgia. And I'll show you that from this graphic. These are the 5 major hurricanes to ever impact Georgia, anywhere in the state. You can see the 1854 and 1893 hurricanes made landfall on the northern Georgia coast. The 1898 hurricane, which was the last major hurricane before Michael to impact the United States or to impact Georgia, was just south of Brunswick. 1896 did not make landfall on the coast, but came up through Florida. But you can see from that line that's going parallel to the Georgia coast, it also did not hit southwest Georgia. So Michael was the first hurricane that was this strong to impact southwest Georgia the way that it did. It was really unprecedented. And to go back to this previous slide, we saw devastating agricultural damage in the billions of dollars in southwest Georgia. We saw widespread tree and power line damage. Some areas in far southwest Georgia, the power was out for upwards of 2 weeks because in some of the counties we heard that every single power line was snapped. And I believe it was Seminole County, almost every single tree that was in the county was damaged. We saw hundreds of millions of acres, not acres, tons, hundreds of millions of tons of tree damage from this storm, and that all culminated to create a multi-billion-dollar disaster in Georgia from Hurricane Michael. Just a little bit more about how historically significant Hurricane Michael was, not just in Georgia, but in the entire United States. Look at the names of these hurricanes on these lists. So on the left is the strongest hurricanes by maximum wind. Labor Day hurricane of 1935, one of the most devastating hurricanes to ever impact the United States, thousands of deaths, 185 miles per hour maximum winds at landfall. And even on the right-hand side, you see that same hurricane ranked by pressure. It was also the most intense hurricane to ever make landfall in the U.S. Camille in 1969, also one of the worst hurricanes to impact the United States. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 was the last Cat 5 to make landfall in the United States, and it was in the Miami area. Then we had Michael, and then you see Katrina, 2005. So just looking at this list of names and then putting Michael there really shows you how historically significant Hurricane Michael was. It was not just another run-of-the-mill hurricane that we get in the United States. It was one of the worst ever in the country. And another interesting thing I found was that 3 of those hurricanes I just mentioned, the Labor Day hurricane, Hurricane Andrew, and Hurricane Camille, in addition to Michael, were all tropical storms 3 days before they made landfall. So all of these storms rapidly intensified, and it just goes to show that you have to prepare for the storm to be stronger at landfall than it is currently being forecast. There are models that specifically try and target the rapid intensification. They do pretty well, and Michael still outpaced all of those models whose specific task it is to pinpoint rapid intensification. Michael outpaced it almost for its entire lifespan. Michael and Irma, as well as Harvey, this was at the time of landfall when Michael was thought to be a Category 4. That made Harvey in Texas, Irma in Florida and Georgia, and Michael in Florida the first time on record that the continental United States had ever had 3 Cat 4 landfalls in 2 years. So a really unprecedented couple of seasons that we saw in 2017 and 2018. And then if you throw in Hurricane Maria on the right, which hit Puerto Rico, that made 4 Category 4 U.S. landfalling hurricanes in less than 14 months. So it was really one after another. Harvey, Irma, and Maria all came in pretty rapid succession to one another as well. And Irma and Maria both impacted Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico was kind of weakened from Irma and then had Maria move over as a Cat 4 and just devastating the island. So again, a super active couple of years. That was after several years of really not a whole lot going on during hurricane season. So to see these hurricanes occur in these couple of seasons was pretty devastating, and probably the worst back-to-back hurricane seasons we've had since 04, 05. So again, if anybody has any questions throughout this, please type them in the chat box and let me know, and I'll be glad to answer them. This is basically the outline of the damage that occurred in Georgia from Hurricane Michael. 108 of the 159 counties in Georgia ended up being designated in FEMA's emergency declaration for public assistance. And that inner strip there is really the area that took the most damage. Not only did they get public assistance, but they also got individual assistance as well. So this basically just lines up with the track of the hurricane. And this is a couple of satellite images I took during the landfall of the hurricane. These are just in succession, so on the timeline it's the left, and then where the left-hand image stops, the right-hand image starts. But you can see how well defined the eye is as it comes ashore in Florida. An extremely powerful hurricane. It went through multiple eye wall replacement cycles, which just is another way of saying re-intensification cycles of the hurricane. And so within, I would say, 2 or 3 days of it making landfall, we knew that it had the potential of being a Category 4 hurricane and ended up making landfall as a Category 5. And then I mentioned before, on the right-hand side, you can see how well the hurricane maintained its structure as it moved through the Florida Panhandle over land and into southwest Georgia. And the eye wall even made it into Seminole County, and that's where we saw that 150-mile-per-hour wind.
Will, we have had a question about predictions for the severity of hurricanes to come, but I want to make sure that you get to the content you're going to cover later in the presentation as well.
Sure. Are we just talking about hurricanes in general in the future, or in this coming of season in particular?
The question says, would you care to make a prediction about the severity of hurricanes to come? Are they going to get worse due to warming waters off our coast or climate change?
Yeah, so that sounds more like in general. It's a great question. There are some studies out there that show that certain aspects of the hurricanes will get stronger, although those same studies show that the frequency of hurricanes may actually end up decreasing, and the frequency of landfalling hurricanes may decrease. So even though the landfalling hurricanes may be marginally stronger as we move into the future, with higher maximum winds, higher storm surge values, and higher amounts of rainfall that occur as those hurricanes make landfall, because of the warming ocean and the changing climate, some of those hurricanes may actually stay further out to sea and not come as close to making landfall. So if you're talking about the overall impact, they tend to cancel each other out a little bit, but for the most part, I would say that we may see slightly less frequent landfalling hurricanes, but those landfalling hurricanes may be a bit stronger than we're used to seeing. And I think we've seen that over the past few years. So hopefully that makes sense and answers your question.
Thank you. And we've had another question. Does the category of the hurricane help predict the flooding potential?
That's another great question. The answer is not really. Obviously, the stronger the hurricane is, the more potential there is for it to pack some pretty heavy rain. But if you remember from Michael, Michael was about as strong as it gets, and the state of Georgia didn't get a whole lot of rainfall out of it. I think the highest totals that we saw were actually in the metro Atlanta area. And it was like 5 or 6 inches of rain from Hurricane Michael. And in parts of South Georgia, they saw 2, 3, 4 inches of rain from it. The factor that most lines up with precipitation amounts with hurricanes is the forward speed of the hurricane. So the reason that Georgia didn't get a whole lot of rainfall out of Michael was because the hurricane was moving so quickly. It wasn't necessarily the strength of it. So think back to Hurricane Harvey a couple of years ago when it entered Texas. It was moving very slowly when it entered Texas, and then it just sat there and spun for a week and did not really move at all. And then there was just no driving force in the atmosphere to kick it out and to push it along. So it sat there and spun over Texas and pulled moisture up out of the Gulf. And that's why we saw that 40 to 60 inches of rainfall, which is like 2 years worth of rainfall for them out there in a week or a week and a half. And Florence as well is another example of this. Like I showed you earlier, Florence slowed way down in forward motion before it made landfall in the Carolinas. And its slow movement to the west was what caused there to be this 20 to 30 inches of rainfall in the Carolinas. And then finally when a frontal passage moved and picked it up and moved it to the north. So as far as rainfall totals in hurricanes, the biggest factor is the forward motion or the forward speed of the hurricane.
That's so helpful, thank you. And we've got one more great question. So good job, guys, keep them coming. And this question is, do you know of any changes we may see in operating procedures or best practices regarding how we, being part of a community's free public resources, monitor and react to hurricanes?
That is a great question. I think that a trend that I've noticed, I certainly can't speak for the way that you guys operate in your own jurisdictions, but one of the ways that we at the state level, at GMA specifically, have started to change the way we operate is moving closer to operating for the worst case scenario of any situation, because it's one thing to operate based on what the forecast says, but it's another thing to operate based on what the forecast says it could be. And so we've actually tended towards over-preparing, overreacting to severe weather events, to hurricanes, to winter weather events, to really all weather events. We have in just recent years started to take more, not more seriously, but just factor in much more to our operational rhythm, preparing for that upper end scenario, that worst case scenario, because we have seen events like what we've talked about where, you know, if we had prepared for Michael to be a Category 2 hurricane a couple of days before, our preparation may have looked a lot different than what it looked like when we were preparing for it to be a Category 4. Same thing with winter weather. I'm going to talk about the winter weather event that we had, or non-event really, that we had in January of this year. We over-prepared for it. We overreacted to it because we saw what the potential could be. So for you, I think that the danger with all this is kind of the crying wolf thing. Is like, if you over-prepare for everything and people start to figure out that, you know, they're over-preparing, they'll take what we're doing and saying less seriously. But on the flip side, we have seen so many events in recent memory, end up being worse or much worse than we had prepared for or that we thought it could be. So we really have to operate much closer to that worst case scenario than we probably have in the past. So however that applies to you, I think that's just the way we've kind of adapted over the last few years.
Great, thank you so much. And please, if you have questions, type them into the chat box, and I'll let Will continue with his presentation.
Okay, so in December we had several days of rainfall. It wasn't particularly heavy rainfall. It was more moderate rainfall, but when you get moderate rainfall falling in the same spots over and over again, they tend to add up. This was the forecast on the left-hand side. So the forecast from the National Weather Service and the Weather Prediction Center was for parts of northwest Georgia to receive upwards of 5 to 7 inches of rain, and then moving closer to the metro area to see more like 2 to 3. What ended up happening is on the right, and we saw 2 to 3 inches of rain in northwest Georgia, which over a 24-hour period is certainly nothing to sneeze at. That's a lot of rainfall for a 24-hour period. But what we saw was this band of showers form and start to line up in that area from LaGrange to Atlanta up towards Gainesville and Rabun County, where we saw 4 to 6 inches of rainfall in a 24-hour period, which is substantial. That's like close to 50 or 100 year flooding. And what we saw from that was rapidly rising river conditions. By the way, I created a list of links of URLs to send out to you guys that have websites that I use that I get a lot of the information that I've shared in this presentation from. And one of them is the Southeast River Forecast Center, which is on the left, a great tool to show you what the river flooding situation looks like across the Southeast. And if you click on those little squares there, up pops the graphic you see on the right. This one was near and dear to my heart because it's about 200 feet upstream from where I live. And so when this flooding situation was starting to unfold, I started taking a look at this creek conditions just upstream from where I live at. And you can see that on Thursday, December 27th, that evening, the river was at 3 feet of depth. And then by the time we got to Friday midday, I mean, that's like, 15 or 18 hours later, the creek has risen to 19 feet into moderate flood stage. On the website, when you click on these points and you see these graphs, not only can you see where minor flooding, moderate flooding, major flooding starts and where the creek is at any given time, it also shows the forecast, which is that little black line that you see on the right. And it kind of had it steadily, kind of dying off, and it really fell just about as rapidly as it rose earlier in the day. But it also shows at each foot level, so each, I guess, every 2 feet in this situation, it shows the actual roads, streets, homes, the areas that will start to see flooding and what type of conditions you would start to see. So in my situation, what I looked at was at 21 feet, my road that I live on would actually start to see 1 to 2 feet of water standing on it from this river that's overflowed. So think about how close that is. We were 1.5 feet between not seeing anything, any flooding on our street, which is what happened, versus seeing 1 to 2 feet of water outside our door. So that's a really useful tool to be able to tell not only what's going on with the rivers, with the flooding, but also the impacts that could occur at each level. So next up, I've talked about it a little bit, but we had a little event called the Super Bowl in Atlanta this past first week of February, and there were several models that were showing the chances of seeing some snow in northwest Georgia. One of these models is on the right there. Some snow, I believe it was the Tuesday before the Super Bowl. So that whole week there were festivities all over the city. There were events. We estimated that we had about 75,000 extra people in Atlanta that were just there that week for the Super Bowl specifically, many of whom did not live in Georgia or the Southeast. And so to have 1 to 2 inches of snow possible in and around the metro area was certainly much more significant than if we were to get 1 to 2 inches of snow in Atlanta any other week or over the weekend, for instance. It was just the fact that we had this enormous event with, obviously all eyes were on us. And 1 to 2 inches may not seem like a lot, but if you think back to 2014, 1 to 2 inches of snow is actually what fell, and that's what prompted the disaster that occurred 5 years ago. So not only do we have that in the back of our heads, but this time it was ratcheted up a couple notches because the Super Bowl was in town that week. So the National Weather Service issued a winter storm watch, which is on the far left you see there, and then the forecast snowfall totals are there. Again, doesn't look that significant for any other time, but particularly for this week, all eyes were on us, and we had to be extremely, extremely cautious. Speaking of the watches, warnings, advisories, another issue we ran into in 2014 was some confusion amongst the public about whether a watch to a warning was an upgrade, whether a watch to an advisory was an upgrade, whether a warning to an advisory was a downgrade or an upgrade. There was just a lot of confusion on terminology. So the particular order for watches, warnings, and advisories in the National Weather Service is always as follows. You will first get a watch. That's if it's well forecast out. If things kind of pop up out of nowhere, you probably won't see a watch because we're just past that point. But generally, in the 12 to 48 hours in advance of a storm is when you'll see a watch come out. And what the watch means is just that the conditions are favorable for a winter storm to impact the area. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it means that it could happen in the next 2 days or so. Oftentimes, as we move closer to the event, so up to 36 hours, if we're within that 24 to 36 hour time frame and the conditions look like they are going to materialize, then the National Weather Service will upgrade that watch to a warning. If there's snow involved, they will most likely issue a winter storm warning. If there is ice involved, if it's just freezing rain and no snow, then they will probably upgrade it to an ice storm warning. That's just the difference there. It just depends on the specific type of precipitation they're talking about. Freezing rain is when the droplets fall as a liquid and then land on an object and freeze on contact. So that's how we see a lot of ice on trees, power lines, cars. You'll see this, like it looks like it's just raining, but then all of a sudden this ice is forming. That's freezing rain. versus sleet, which falls as frozen precipitation with kind of liquid on the inside, so it's a little slushy, versus snow, which is just a solid flake. But what we ran into in 2014 with confusion was that we went from a winter storm watch to a winter weather advisory, and the public didn't seem to be clear that that was an upgrade. They thought it was a downgrade, so they took it a bit less seriously. A winter weather advisory is different from a warning in that the advisory means that it doesn't look like conditions are going to be dangerous. It looks like conditions are going to cause inconveniences. So a warning is when you really need to take action. A winter weather advisory is this thing is going to cause some inconvenience for you. It's actually an upgrade over a watch. The only time there's a downgrade, the only time you'll see a downgrade is if they have already called for a warning and then change it to an advisory. That's a downgrade because that means we were forecasting something serious, something dangerous. Now we think it's just going to be more of an inconvenience. That's the only time you'll see a downgrade. You never see a warning go to a watch because of the timing. The progression is watch to warning. And then an advisory is just when they don't feel confident that conditions are going to be dangerous, just going to be more of an inconvenience. So this was the January 2019 forecast from the National Weather Service. And I've put this link in the document of links as well. The National Weather Service, particularly in Peachtree City, started doing this type of forecasting a couple of years ago, and I think started to operationalize it last winter. So what you're seeing here is the middle image is the actual forecast. That's the same thing that I showed you on the middle image here. It's just what they actually think is going to happen is the one in the middle. Then they have the best case scenario, which is the low end amount. So that's the image on the left. It's much less. They're saying that the best case scenario is that shaded area only gets less than an inch. The worst case scenario is the one that is shown on the right. And it's saying, basically, given the scenario, given the forecast that we have, given the variables, we're forecasting 1 inch, 2 inches. But what could happen if everything lined up right to be a high-end event, we could see up to 2 inches across the metro area and up to 3 to 4 inches north of the metro area into North Georgia. So this is what we had to look at. Basically, the issue we ran into, again, like I've talked about, was normally we see these kind of weather events probably once or twice on average per winter. And oftentimes they don't amount to a whole lot. Oftentimes we will, delay opening of schools and government or whatnot, but it usually doesn't amount to a whole lot. The difference this time was we had a new mayor, we had a new governor. I think the governor was in his second week of office, and we had the Super Bowl in Atlanta. So basically we're looking at this forecast information from the National Weather Service. They're the best people in the world to make these forecasts, and they're saying, we are forecasting less than an inch of snow. You could get nothing, or you could get 2 inches. That's what we had to work with, and based upon that, we decided to go ahead and take the extra precaution of closing state government for that one day. Again, it wasn't the day of the Super Bowl. It was 5 days before the Super Bowl. But because there was so many extra people in the city, we had to brine the roads. GDOT had to pre-treat the roads, the interstates. We wanted people to stay off the roads so that our road crews could go ahead and pre-treat the roads so that we could prevent some accidents from happening on the interstates there. Another thing that we looked at, and this link is also in the document, I've also put it at the bottom of this slide. The National Weather Service has created what they're calling the WSSI, which is the Winter Storm Severity Index. It's basically a way to visualize and convey the expected severity of a winter weather event. So this is from that same January 2019 system. This is experimental, so it's not operational. They did not share this with the public, even though the website is public facing. They didn't use it. It's simply experimental. They're testing it out. And we looked at this, and what we saw was most of the metro Atlanta area is either expecting minor to moderate severity, minor to moderate impacts from this system. And that lined up pretty well with what we were seeing in the models, what we were hearing from the National Weather Service. And so moderate impacts in a week when, again, all eyes are on us and 75,000 extra people in the city, that kind of nudged us in the direction of extreme caution, out of an abundance of caution, going ahead and taking the precautions we need that week. So if anyone has any questions about that, please let me know about winter weather in general. Okay, so let me move on to the second flooding scenario we ran into, and this was in February. This wasn't actually that bad of an event. The models up to a week before were calling for enormous amounts of rainfall. Some of the models I was looking at were actually showing upwards of 14 to 15 inches of rain in some spots in North Georgia over about a 7 to 10 day period, which is a lot of rain. We would have seen definitely seen river flooding all over the state, and we would have seen some pretty dangerous flooding. I think we actually did get some pretty serious flooding in the Rome area from this event. But on the left-hand graphic is what actually happened. You can see in northwest Georgia, some areas did end up getting 10 to 15 inches. This is actually for the entire month of February, so not just from that 10-day period. But North Georgia got a lot of rainfall and saw some instances of flooding. What I want to show you now is the image on the right is what's called the excessive rainfall outlook, and this comes from the Weather Prediction Center, which is a sister agency of the National Weather Service. Basically what they do is take 4 categories. You see them on the legend in the bottom right: marginal, slight, moderate, and high. And they're trying to convey the probability of seeing excessive rainfall. The definition of excessive rainfall is simply rainfall that would result in flooding conditions. So for this, this was in the middle of February, just one day out of that event. There was actually a high risk of flooding in parts of Tennessee, northwest Alabama, northeast Mississippi. And high-risk flooding days are pretty rare. Basically what they're saying is there's a greater than 50% chance in this area that there's going to be flooding conditions. Almost all of the major flooding conditions we see occur in those high-risk forecasts and situations. So again, this is the chart that they use to basically try and convey the probability that there may be flash flooding. A marginal risk of excessive rainfall, we see those a lot. It just means that isolated flash flooding is possible. When you go up to a slight risk, it means that scattered flash flooding is also possible, just more widespread chances. It will mostly be localized. It'll mostly be urban areas where you can see some drainage backup with debris, with leaves, and that kind of thing. We see those every so often. A moderate risk of excessive rainfall, which you can see here, the tip of northwest Georgia was in. That means that numerous flash floods are likely. And a high risk, again, when I said the rare high risk, that is, you're almost certain to see some flash flooding happening. And you can find this on WPC's website, which I have put in the list of links that is in the Google Drive folder. But if you just go to WPC.ncep, it's right here on the screen there. WPC.ncep.noaa.gov is WPC's website, and you can find the excessive rainfall outlook for today, tomorrow, and the following day. They always do 3 days of excessive rainfall outlooks. This is a really good product for being able to tell what the probability, what your risk of seeing flooding is day to day. In a very similar vein, the Storm Prediction Center has a risk category system, and it's the same as WPC's, except there's one more category, and that's the enhanced category. So it starts at the very bottom with thunderstorms. We see these general thunderstorm risks almost every single day in Georgia. Just means that severe weather is not expected, but you could see some thunderstorms. That's basically what it is. A marginal risk is where we get these all the time as well. We've probably been in a dozen of these already in the month of June. Isolated severe thunderstorms are possible, but they're going to be real spotty. A slight risk, we start to see those a bit less frequently. We might see them a handful of times a month during severe weather season. This is when scattered severe thunderstorms are possible. This is typically when we see most of our severe thunderstorm warnings. In a slight risk, just means that severe storms are probably going to occur. They are not going to be widespread. They're still going to be pretty hit or miss, but those storms, when they do hit, some of them are going to be pretty intense. An enhanced risk, we start to see a few times a year in Georgia. And an enhanced risk is what we're going to talk about next with the tornado outbreak that we had on March 3rd. We see enhanced risk a few times a year, and this is where there are several severe storms occurring in Georgia. And most of them are going to be pretty strong. You could see large hail. You could see most of these storms are going to pose the risk of having damaging thunderstorm winds of at least 60 miles per hour. And this is where you start to see your pretty serious tornado risk take off. The even less frequent moderate risk, I only remember seeing these in Georgia about 2 or 3 times in the last 5 years. That's where basically it's going to be a bad day for some areas. Long-lived, widespread, and intense severe thunderstorms. And then the super rare high risk, I think we've only got this in Georgia once or twice in my 5 years at GEMA. And the Tornado Alley in the Midwest sees a few high-risk days a year. And these are the extreme tornado outbreaks. You know, you can see the picture at the bottom of the high risk. That's like a mile-wide tornado. That's the type of thing you see during a high risk. They're super rare. The only one I can remember in Georgia was a couple of years ago when we had a tornado outbreak in South Georgia, and one of them hit the city of Albany. That was a high-risk day. Other than that, I think the last one before that was probably in 2011. So they're very rare. So going to the March 3rd, 2019 tornado outbreak, you can see on the map on the left that most of the state was in a slight risk, and then the inner ring there, the enhanced risk, included Columbus, Macon, Dublin, Albany, Tifton, and all those areas in between, was really the bullseye of where the threat was going to be that day. We saw, I think, yeah, we got some models here. I know they move pretty quick, but that's just how GIFs are. But you can see a line of thunderstorms really forming in Alabama and then moving through southwest Georgia in particular, and really across all of South Georgia. That's what we were looking at 1 to 2 days before the models really started to show that strong line of thunderstorms fire up and move through southwest Georgia. That's when we really started to get pretty worried about the areas in south central and southwest Georgia. And then the day of, the tornado watch on the right there, a very large tornado watch. It encompassed probably half the state, and we saw numerous, I think I counted like 50-something tornado warnings that were issued that day, and most of those were in the tornado watch. So this is what happened on March 3rd. This is probably the worst tornado outbreak we had in 2 years. Yeah, I think this is probably the worst we had in 2 years. The image on the left is basically where the rotation occurred. So just think of those lines as just like paths of a rotating thunderstorm. And that really lines up well with the right-hand image, which is, those are the actual tornado warnings that were issued. All those little red polygons, each one of those is a tornado warning. And then the black triangles you see on there were actually reports of tornadoes. So you can see here, this was the really, really bad one. It moved through Lee County, Alabama as an EF4 tornado, killed 23 people, I think, and injured about, I think, 90 in all. Yeah, 23 deaths in Alabama and 90 injuries just from this one tornado right here. Thankfully, and for reasons that I have no idea, it crossed the river, weakened to an EF3, and ended up only injuring 12 people in Georgia, and miraculously we had 0 deaths in Georgia that day from these tornadoes. I think only 12 injuries in Georgia, and 7 of those were in this particular tornado. So that was the worst of them. But we also had several tornadoes down here in southwest Georgia, even some into southeast Georgia. But all in all, on March 3rd, there were 21 confirmed tornadoes, 21 confirmed separate tornadoes in Georgia on March 3rd. And like I said, 12 people were injured. This was a bad one. We knew it was going to be bad the day before, but things really started to line up the evening before and the morning of this tornado outbreak. After a brief 6-week reprieve, we had another strong line of thunderstorms move through Georgia. You can see on the left that the Storm Prediction Center had placed us in another enhanced risk, much like the March 3rd outbreak. We were not expecting that level of severe weather. And in hindsight, going back to the March 3rd one, this ended up being more like a moderate risk. This event, it was an enhanced risk going in. I think it turned out to be more of a moderate risk. I really like the Storm Prediction Center's way of categorizing these risks. I find them extremely helpful. I think I'm in the minority of people that think that. A lot of people complain that they're confusing, but if you really understand what they're trying to convey, I think it can be helpful. And the other thing is, when the Storm Prediction Center overestimates or underestimates an event, it seems like that it's never more than one category more or one category less. So like in this situation, it was enhanced, and it ended up being more like a moderate. And then there's other enhanced risks that turn out to be more like slight risk. So you never really see an enhanced risk that ends up being a 1, a marginal risk, or an enhanced risk that ends up being like a 5, a high risk. So if you just kind of understand what they're trying to say, the conditions that are possible, I think this can be a really helpful product. So again, this was an enhanced risk day, but it was a bit different. We weren't expecting as many tornadoes. We were expecting more damaging wind and even some hail threat this day. And we ended up having 6 tornadoes on April 14th in Georgia. 3 of them were EF0s, which are the weakest, and 3 of them were EF1s. And thankfully, once again, we had no reports of deaths or injuries from this event. Then, a mere 5 days later, we had yet another strong line of thunderstorms move through. And it's not surprising that these happened in the middle of April because the primary severe weather season in Georgia and in the southeast and really across the country, the primary severe weather season is March to May. So April, mid-April being pretty much the center of that, it was not surprising that we saw 2 straight weeks of pretty bad storms move through. Our secondary severe weather season is in the fall. That's not a widely known fact, but we tend to see another slight uptick in the number of severe weather events in the fall as well, and even see some tornadoes then. And that's just because with the changing seasons, there's some changes in the jet stream, and we'll start to see those really powerful fronts move through again, much like we do in the spring. But on Friday, April 19th, we were expecting another enhanced risk come out from the Storm Prediction Center, and the maps got a little tricky because the cutoff for Thursday is actually Friday morning at 7 a.m. and the Friday map starts at 7 a.m. So what you can tell from this is just that the line was moving through overnight Thursday into Friday and then firing back up in central and eastern parts of Georgia on Friday. But we did have another enhanced risk, and a pretty nasty looking line of storms moved through. We ended up having 4 tornadoes from this line of storms. 2 were EF0 and 2 were EF1. Again, it was a pretty well forecast event. And thankfully, once again, we had no deaths and no injuries. One more thing I want to show you about kind of the probabilities of what types of severe weather you may be getting, because like I've shown you, not all severe weather situations are the same. The 3 severe weather events I've shown you are March 3rd, April 14th, and April 19th. All 3 of those were given an enhanced risk from the Storm Prediction Center, and yet all 3 events had different impacts. Obviously, May 3rd, the primary threat was tornadoes. We ended up seeing an outbreak. But in April, those 2 events weren't necessarily so much focused towards tornadoes. Not all severe weather events are the same. Some of them, the primary threat is tornadoes. Some, the primary threat is damaging winds. That's what we've seen the past couple of weeks, is in these severe storms are damaging winds. The tornado threat's been very low. Sometimes the primary threat is just hail. The atmospheric profile is set up and really primed for some large hail. So you can get, again, the same product. You get a severe thunderstorm watch, severe thunderstorm warning, but the primary threat is hail, not necessarily tornadoes or damaging winds. So what you really have to do at that point to know what you're kind of in for is to look more specifically at the products. So this is just from each of these tornado watches here, just below it, there's this chart that shows you the hazard and the likelihood of those hazards. So for April 19th, in the Tornado Watch 86, which is the one in southwest and west central Georgia, the likelihood of tornadoes occurring in that watch was moderate. There was a 50% chance of seeing 2 or more tornadoes in that watch. And there was a 30% or moderate chance of seeing 1 or more strong tornadoes in that watch. So really just from looking at this, you can see, okay, so here's the tornado threat, here's the wind, the severe wind threat, and here's the hail threat. So you can just look at this and in 2 seconds go, this is a tornado and a wind threat. Probability of 10 or more severe wind events occurring, 50% moderate. But you're probably not going to see hurricane force winds in some of these thunderstorms. And you're probably not going to see much hail at all. Similarly for the tornado watch on the right, that was in southeast Georgia, moderate risk of seeing 2 or more tornadoes. And by the way, this moderate risk and these percentages are different from the storm prediction centers. The storm prediction centers are percentages of seeing a particular threat within 25 miles of a point. So like if your house is in that enhanced risk, you've got like a 15% chance of seeing severe weather within 25 miles of you. This is simply, there's a 50% chance of seeing 2 or more tornadoes in the entire watch area. So you can look at this and you can say, okay, there's a moderate chance of tornadoes, but the chances of seeing a strong tornado are actually lower than they are in southwest Georgia. Same with the winds. Severe hail, the hail threat is a bit higher in southeast Georgia than it is in southwest Georgia. So just looking at the watch on the Storm Prediction Center's website, you can tell kind of what the hazards are, and you can even put them into a number, a probability. These maps are from just a couple of days ago, a few days ago, on Sunday. Georgia, parts of Georgia were in slight risk for severe weather. That equates to about a 10% chance of seeing severe weather. This is the climatology, or the average of seeing any type of severe weather on June 23rd, which is this day. So on average, let's say the Metro Atlanta area right here. On average, the Metro Atlanta area on this day, on June 23rd, has a 4% chance of seeing severe weather on a normal day. Well, the Storm Prediction Center thinks that there's about a 10% chance that they're going to see severe weather in Metro Atlanta on June 23rd, 2019. So 10% today, on average 4%, so 10 divided by 4, you can say we have a 2.5 times more chance of seeing severe weather this past Sunday in Georgia than we do on a regular day. And you can even get down into the specific types of severe weather. Again, all these maps are found on the Storm Prediction Center's website. This is the same day on Sunday. For tornadoes, specifically tornadoes, not all severe weather, just tornadoes, northern Texas has a 5% chance of seeing a tornado on Sunday, this past Sunday. Okay, 5% chance of a tornado, that means there's a 95% chance I don't see a tornado, right? That doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Well, when you take a look at the normal percent chance that you would see a tornado on any given June 23rd in North Texas, it is 0.4% on any normal day. So on a normal day, you have a 0.4% chance of seeing a tornado. Today, you have a 5% chance of seeing a tornado, which means that you are 10 times more likely to see a tornado on June 23rd, 2019 than you would be any other June 23rd. So it's another way of communicating like the likelihood. If you tell the public you have a 5% chance of seeing a tornado today, they're going to tune you out because 5% chance of rain means it's not going to rain. But you're talking about a tornado, something that is pretty rare. 0.4% chance you see one on these days. If you say there's a 10 times greater chance that you're going to see a tornado today than any other day, any other June 23rd, they're going to go, whoa, there's a tornado threat, because there is. You can do the same thing with the wind, severe wind. Northern Texas, there's a 30% chance that you will see 60-mile-per-hour plus winds in North Texas. Okay, 30% chance of seeing that. 30% chance. That means there's a 70% chance we won't see it. Well, again, any given June 23rd, you have a 2% chance of seeing it. Today you have 30. So there's a 15 times more chance that you are going to see severe wind today than any other June 23rd. It's just another way of visualizing, explaining, conceptualizing the risk that you're at. Normally 2%, today 30%. Same thing with hail. This was actually a big hail event. The hatched area means that it's likely that you're going to have, I don't know the term, like super severe, extra severe, just like really large hail. If this was tornadoes and it was hatched, you would say you have an increased probability of seeing strong tornadoes. So again, you got a 30% chance of seeing hail in here, 1% on a regular day. So your chances of seeing hail today are 30 times higher than usual. Even in Georgia, we had a 2%, 5%. We had a 5% chance of seeing hail that day. Big deal. That means 95% chance we won't. But on a normal day, we only have a 1% chance of seeing hail. So we had a 5 times higher chance of seeing hail that day. I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, so I'm going to move on.
Well, we did have a question. Someone wanting to know if there is more than one tornado alley in Georgia. I think this question was posted a few minutes ago, and I just didn't see it.
Very good question. So Tornado Alley is the term used for the parts of the Midwest that get most of the tornadoes. There is actually a secondary tornado alley in the United States, and it is in the southeast, and it does run through Georgia, and it's referred to as Dixie Alley. Not a joke. Dixie Alley is basically like Tornado Alley for the southeast. So hopefully that answers your question. More terminology. Again, we already talked about watches versus warnings when it pertains to winter weather. Same thing for severe weather. With a watch, the conditions are favorable for severe weather. It means that they could form. Oftentimes you'll see a watch come out and you look at the radar and there's nothing on the radar because they're saying that things are about to start firing up. The conditions are favorable for severe weather. Could cover a large area. Sometimes we see 60 or 80 counties in Georgia in one severe thunderstorm watch. And it'll usually come out 4, 6, 8 hours before these storms start to become severe. When you see a severe thunderstorm watch come out, the actions you need to take are to be aware and to monitor for any warnings, because warnings are when you should take action. It means that severe weather is occurring or is imminent. This goes for severe thunderstorm warnings or tornado warnings. These warnings typically last half an hour to an hour. They typically cover a small area, either anywhere between 1 county or 5 counties or parts of a county. And this is when you need to take action. So make sure, and I'll cover this at the end, make sure that you have alerts set up, whether it's on your phone or your computer or whatnot, so that when these watches and warnings are issued, you get those alerts. And then that's when you start really being hyper aware. It's when you start regularly checking that day to see if any warnings come out, because when a warning occurs in your area, that's when you need to take action, take shelter, get in the lowest part of your home, most interior part, and all that good stuff. Tornado sheltering guidelines. I believe, I can't remember what particular event this was, but it was recent. I think it was this year. There was a lady's house that was completely destroyed, and she was in the very middle of the house in a well-constructed room, and it was the only thing standing in that house, and she was just fine, and her house was completely destroyed. So you don't want to be in a mobile home, you do not want to be in a vehicle, and a big mistake that a lot of people make is they go underneath a highway overpass. That is a terrible idea, because winds are actually much stronger. You kind of get that tunneling effect in there. That's just a terrible idea. Large open rooms, bad idea. Manufactured housing, bad idea. You really need to either get in a basement or get in the innermost room of a well-constructed home or building. And the best options, obviously recommended by FEMA, you either have a shelter or a safe room specifically designed by FEMA's specifications. So if you don't have a storm shelter, which most people in Georgia don't, a basement or the lowest, most interior part of a well-built home is your best bet. And most of the time that'll work out pretty well for you. And another important thing is to wait until it is all clear. Have, again, a way to receive those alerts and check in and find out if the warning is over, or probably be tuned into a radio station. So I feel kind of bad because I kind of teased you earlier with what we can expect this hurricane season. The answer, honestly, is nobody really knows. And two graphics I like to show to explain this are the one on the left in particular. This is the complete history of tropical cyclones in the Atlantic between 1851, which is when records began, and the present. Look how wide-ranging all those tracks are. Hurricanes will form this year. They will probably impact land, but the science is not good enough yet to predict exactly how many hurricanes will form. That's why they give ranges. The science is not advanced enough yet to predict how many landfalling hurricanes we'll have. Basically, there are well-educated guesses that occur from the professionals and experts, which I am not. But they take into account sea surface temperature anomalies, climate pattern anomalies, all these different variables. And basically what they've come out with so far this year is that it's probably going to be about an average season. Their forecasts are pretty good, but the problem is, what do you do with that information? If they say, okay, we're going to have 12 to 16 hurricanes or tropical systems form this year, 3 to 7 of those are going to be hurricanes, 2 to 3 of those are going to be major hurricanes. What do you do with that information? And the answer really is the same regardless, because the cliche is it only takes one, but truly We have had hurricane seasons that were forecast to be below average activity, and they were below average activity, and 1 or 2 hurricanes created complete devastation for communities. So your community can be destroyed in a below average season, or in a highly above average season, you could have absolutely nothing. So the answer that I always like to give when people ask what kind of hurricane season are we going to have is, it doesn't matter. You need to focus on what you can control. You need to get ready and have a plan in place for if and when a storm like this, like the ones we've been seeing, if a tropical storm or a hurricane is to hit your area, you've got to be ready for it. Because as was the case with Michael, people only had 2 to 3 days to really prepare for it, which is not a lot of time at all. Almost all hurricane, tropical cyclone-related deaths occur from flooding. People get all hyped up about the winds, and oftentimes for good reason, particularly along the coast. That's where the winds are the strongest. But 50% of hurricane deaths occur from storm surge, and that's not just along the coast. It can be several miles inland from the coast, depending on how bad the hurricane is and what the elevation is. 25% happen in rainfall-induced flooding. We saw that in North Carolina during Hurricane Matthew. I think there were 22 deaths in North Carolina from Hurricane Matthew when Hurricane Matthew made landfall in Florida, moved parallel to the Georgia coast, and then made landfall and weakened in South Carolina. The center of Hurricane Matthew was never in North Carolina, but parts of North Carolina got 2 feet of rain in a few days, and they had to do swift water rescues, and close to 24 people died in North Carolina from Hurricane Matthew. Same thing in Harvey, rainfall-induced flooding. Storm surge was not a big deal in Harvey because it was not a fast-moving storm. It really was the rainfall-induced flooding that we saw with Harvey. So that leaves only 25% of deaths occurring from being in the off the coast in the over the ocean, from 5 to 10% from wind, 5% from tornado. So that graphic really just is meant to show you that storm surge flooding and rainfall-induced flooding are the big things that you got to worry about. They always say, run from water, hide from wind, meaning if you're getting storm surge, you need to leave. You need to evacuate. If there's no storm surge threat and you're just getting wind, it's okay to shelter there if you're in a well-built facility or home. I've also heard you can breathe in 80-mile-per-hour wind, but you can't do it underwater. So just another way of saying when you're getting storm surge or rainfall-induced flooding is expected, you need to evacuate to an area that is not expected to get those things. The wind, you can mostly handle. The graphic on the right is from the Chatham Emergency Management Agency. Really good graphic on just what to do before and after a storm hits. Last slide. What can we do to prepare for when significant weather events like this happen again in Georgia? Not if, but when. Because as I've showed, just in the past year, we've had multiple flooding incidents. We've had multiple severe weather incidents. We've had 1, almost 2 major hurricane incidents. And we've had winter weather events, not so much this year, but in past years, they have been the big deals. Number 1, be informed. That's what you're doing right now. That's what you will do when you sign up to receive alerts and put your plan in place. Number 2, make a plan. You need to have a plan to if there is a need for you to evacuate your home, You need to have those plans in place well beforehand. Not only make a plan for these situations, but make sure that everyone in your family actually knows what the plan is. Build a ready kit. You can do that on the websites to the right, ready.gov and ready.georgia.gov. Those two websites are really excellent resources. Ready.gov is by FEMA. Ready.georgia.gov is a project that GEMA has worked on. So ready.georgia.gov is more specific to the state of Georgia, and ready.gov is obviously national, but extremely good information on what specifically you need for each type of event. And it also is not just limited to weather events. It talks about making a plan, being informed, building ready kits for all types of hazards, whether man-made or natural. Get involved. Again, you're doing that right now by participating in this and continuing to do things like this, and then be prepared to take action. So I really highly recommend that you go to these two websites at the end. It's probably the most important thing you can do off of this presentation. Go through the material they have on there. It's really, really good information, and it shows you step by step how to build a ready kit and everything that you need to make a plan for. So with that, I will turn it back over to Angela, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Will. That was so informative and really helps to, I think, put some of these weather concerns into context and tell us how to interpret some of the data that we get. I'll open it up one more time to questions from participants. You can feel free to type right into the chat box. And we'll just give one more minute to see if there are any lingering questions. Okay, I don't see where anyone is typing, so if you have any questions, I am sure that Will would be happy to follow up. We do have a couple of thank yous, so some really helpful explanations. I'm so glad to hear that. Again, the webinar course materials are available at the link that was pasted into the chat box earlier in the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be sent out to all participants once it's available. Will, thank you again. This was wonderful, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely. Thank y'all so much.
All right. Thanks. Take care, everyone.